Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Integrating Wearable Remote Biosensor Technology into Decentralized Clinical Trials. My name is Ryan Muse, and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. Now, the webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance along the way, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this same chat panel. At this time, know that all participants are in listen-only mode, and please note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Medpace and Vivalink, who developed the content for this presentation. Medpace is a scientifically driven, global, full-service clinical contract research organization providing phase 1 to 4 clinical development services to the biotechnology, pharmaceutical, and medical device industries. Medpace's mission is to accelerate the global development of safe and effective medical therapeutics through its high science and disciplined operating approach that leverages regulatory and therapeutic expertise across all major areas. And Vivalink is a provider of digital healthcare solutions for virtual patient care and decentralized clinical trials. Vivalink leverages unique physiology-optimized medical wearable sensors and data services to enable a deeper and more clinical understanding between provider and patient. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Dr. Richard S. Lee is a board-certified cardiothoracic surgeon with an extensive background in a full range of adult cardiac surgery, including valve repair and replacement, coronary artery bypass grafting, aortic aneurysm surgery, surgery for atrial fibrillation, and transcatheter aortic valve replacement. He also has extensive research experience in transplantation immunology. Dr. Lee has been board-certified in cardiothoracic surgery since 2007. Dr. Salvatore Zapatino has over 30 years of experience in pharmaceutical and device clinical research. He has been a part of Medpace leadership team since its founding in 1992 and has held leadership roles across a number of functional areas. He focuses on integrating and optimizing the clinical, operational, and technical aspects needed to conduct multinational studies across multiple therapeutic indications. And Mariel Fabro specializes in emerging medical technologies, disease management solutions, and accelerating first-generation products to market. Her product principles blend biomedical innovation with technology infrastructure to solve unmet needs in healthcare. She is a co-inventor on 39 issued patents spanning cardiology, vascular surgery, neurosurgery, general surgery, and women's health. And so now, without further ado, though, I'd like to hand the presentation over to our first speaker today, Dr. Richard Lee. You may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to the audience and my fellow speakers, Dr. Zabatino and Mariel Fabro, for joining Medpace and Vivalink for today's webinar. It is a pleasure to have this opportunity to engage the pharma and device community with this webinar. We hope today's presentation stimulates a lot of thought, discussion. I'm going to kick off our webinar by summarizing the current ecosystem of remote biosensor technology in clinical trials. Sal will speak more, Dr. Zabatino will speak more of selection and integration of wearables into clinical trials, and then Mariel Fabro will present 3 excellent case studies illustrating the integration harmonization process, as well as data risk mitigations. Next slide, please. The evolution in digital technology and biowearables has helped support the progression of clinical trial design from a completely centralized site-based model to a fully decentralized siteless model, but more commonly to a hybrid design in which one or more elements of the conduct of the trial is performed remotely in the patient's home using digital sensors and biowearables This focus has shifted to the concept of patient-centric trials in which patient safety and convenience are prioritized without compromising data integrity and clinical trial endpoints. The COVID-19 pandemic certainly has pushed to the forefront of clinical trials the digital evolution in clinical research that was present prior, but lagging behind innovation in technology. The digital evolution has now become what I call the digital revolution. Indeed, the pandemic has ushered in a new era of patient-centric or personalized clinical trials. Certainly, that is here to stay. In fact, the majority of clinical trials in 2021 were hybrid in that some element of the trial was performed at the patient's home rather than a research site. This may include digital sensors, biowearables, telemedicine, e-consent, e-pro, and in-home nursing visits. Next slide, please. What is the prevalence of DCTs and hybrid clinical trials, HCTs, in a post-pandemic world? Well, a survey was performed by Oracle in November of 2020 of 252 employees in pharma, and device, and CRO, and this indicated that 76% of respondents used decentralized trials. Moreover, 38% of respondents report more than half of their trials are now decentralized. Indeed, COVID-19 has accelerated the acceptance of virtual solutions to clinical trial management. A survey conducted by the WCG CenterWatch of several hundred respondents at clinical research sites shows a rapid shift of acceptance of virtual procedures, such as remote coordinators, telemedicine, and remote monitoring since COVID-19. And this is summarized in the bar chart on the right, where now the majority of sites, over 60%, are using virtual solutions, which is a stark contrast from the percentage usage pre-COVID. Moreover, it's also important to remember that the FDA guidance on clinical trials of medicinal products during COVID-19, which was updated most recently in August of 2021, also supports the use of virtual procedures such as video conferencing for virtual visits during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So what is the future of decentralized and hybrid clinical trials? I think we can say with confidence that some form of virtual solutions will continue in clinical trials now and in the future. Clearly, COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the routine utilization of DCTs and HCTs for clinical research. An analysis by McKinsey Consulting demonstrated that the majority of some 245 investigators in the UK, in the US, and in France predict increased use of remote sensing technology and other DCT procedures, even after the pandemic. For example, most investigators think that telemedicine, visits, remote patient monitoring, virtual SIVs, e-consent, e-COA, and in-home nurse visits will continue to be integral components of clinical trials post-pandemic. I think it's fair to say that DCTs and HCTs in some form are here to stay. Next slide, please. COVID-19 may have been the spark that ignited this very sudden and urgent implementation of DCTs and HCTs, but remote digital biosensors provide the necessary fuel to drive the evolution and advancement of DCTs and HCTs. We will continue to witness the development of novel biosensors for clinical research. And this interaction is in truth symbiotic, meaning DCTs conversely drive the innovation in remote biosensing technologies. So the respondents from the aforementioned Oracle survey in industry demonstrated that the most common steps taken to accelerate the adoption of DCT methods at their respective sites are the following. Number one, the adoption of patient-facing technologies, so this includes biosensors. Number 2, protocol redesign to accommodate remote biosensing technology and virtual solutions. And number 3, the adoption of investigator or site-facing technologies, which would include telemedicine, conferencing, remote patient monitoring devices. So the real-world data underscores the necessity for the adoption of digital sensors as part of clinical trial designs. Next slide. So what are the benefits of DCTs and HCTs, or bringing the site to the patient? I've listed a number here, and many in the audience I am sure are familiar with. Patient centricity, patient convenience and tolerability, enrollment of a broader and more diverse population. There are many patients of lower socioeconomic status that are unable to make visits regularly in person at the site. Site access is another benefit, especially during the pandemic where many sites were closed. Reduction of site burden and patient burden. Alignment with the FDA's guidance in that safety is paramount. During the COVID, we all recall that home was safer than the research site. Adaptability of schedule of assessments to give patients the options for virtual visits. Improve patient compliance. And then lastly, possible cost savings with less site resourcing is another potential benefit of decentralized and hybrid clinical trials. If we move on to the next slide, we will discuss potential benefits of wearables. So integral to bringing the site to the patient is bringing the sensor to the patient. So what are the benefits of wearables? Well, the Oracle survey also queried industry respondents that exact question. And as you can see in the bar chart, that patient convenience, comprehensive real-time data, and less site burden were the top 3 benefits of wearables and remote biosensors, according to respondents in pharma, device, and CRO. In the next slide, we'll review some of the challenges of DCTs and HCTs. So while the benefits of DCTs and HCTs are fairly apparent, it is important to recognize there are common pitfalls or challenges. I've listed a number here. Briefly, patient access to internet cannot be assumed. Some patients feel that virtual procedures compromise their relationship with their physician and with the site. It's critical to match the right biosensor with the right trial endpoints. Regulatory guidance and requirements are still maturing, they're still evolving. Medpace recommends early and frequent discussions with the regulators to help define which biosensors are acceptable for what endpoints. And one resource that is online is the Digital Medicine Society Library. This is a crowdsourced library of digital endpoints. It's a good starting point because it lists all the endpoints entered from industry, and it also gives you listings of what phase study and whether the endpoints are used as primary endpoints or secondary endpoints. Currently there's about 19% of the 225 digital endpoints listed are being used as primary endpoints. It's also important to remember that clinical care does not equate to clinical research, and consumer products do not equate to medical devices. Sites must be prepared to collect, integrate, and harmonize prodigious amounts of data from biosensors. Dr. Zabatino and Mariel are going to provide examples of how Medpace and Vivalink perform such important processes. There's also a learning curve involved with biosensors for both patients and sites. This is certainly a real-world challenge. Proper training and education are essential for success. With novel technology, there's also a risk for protocol deviations. Teaching sites and patients the proper utilization of each biosensor, again, is an integral part of DCTs and HCTs. How do we ensure the quality of digital assessments? We certainly need to protect our endpoints. We need to standardize at-home assessments. We also need to use biosensor platforms that generate automatic audit trails to protect for quality and for inspection readiness. There may be an increased cost of the new technologies, and this poses a challenge or a pitfall. Commercial off-the-shelf software expenses have to be taken into consideration, as well as APIs. And then lastly, scalability. Scaling from a small data set to a large data set for a pivotal trial requires expanded capacity for data storage, for data transfer, data protection, and analysis. If we move on to our next slide, we can, by way of introduction, and as a segue to the next part of this webinar, I just wanted to comment very briefly on how Medpace not only manages DCTs and HCTs operationally, but we also incorporate multiple biosensors within the context of the trial. First of all, Medpace has extensive experience in supporting DCTs and HCTs. For example, we've successfully conducted trials that leverage telemedicine, ePro, eConsent, and various wearable monitors such as rhythm monitors, actigraphy, and continuous glucose monitoring. Certainly the data flow starts with the patient, moves to the biosensors, and then moves to the site and to the CRO. Secondly, Medpace has keen experience integrating these data into the overall study and harmonizes it to present compelling cases to the regulators with the analysis of endpoints. So if you take home, I think, one message today about this webinar, that would be the integration and harmonization of large amounts of data from biosensors. That integration is paramount to study success in DCTs and HCTs. At this point, I would like to invite my colleague, Dr. Zabatino, to elaborate further on Medpace's expertise in selecting and integrating biosensors in DCTs.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for sharing some very good background information and bringing to mind the use of these wearable technologies and decentralized trials. As many of us know, this past year and a half has been challenging for the healthcare industry. And ultimately, we've had to change the paradigm by which we provide healthcare services to our patients. As a result of that, our patients are becoming a bit more used to experiencing those things. And as a result, perhaps being more accommodating as we try to integrate some of these new technologies and procedures in our day-to-day clinical trials. Next slide, please. So from what used to be a want or a desire from our sponsors and from our perhaps even our regulators, it now has almost become an expectation that we utilize these technologies, biosensors, remote visits, and things along those lines. The fact that most of us walk around with at least one cell phone, several people have more than that. We have tablets at home. Internet has become a wide use technology that we have in our homes and everywhere we go. While it can be a challenge, it has made it part of our day-to-day life. And as a result of that, along with the miniaturization of many of these devices, makes the implementation of these technologies much more acceptable and doable in today's environment around the world. However, it isn't without its challenges and benefits. Certainly from the patient's perspective, being able to come to a visit at the clinic multiple times during a study does provide some issues. Being able to get the transport there, the time away from their lives and things like that. Being able to do these remotely is a great benefit to them. Being able to provide that data, that biomedical data from them without having to be prodded by someone at the clinic provides a level of comfort for them, and also provides some real-time feedback for them to be able to see that a blood pressure perhaps has become elevated, their glucose has now been elevated, may require some action. So they get some immediate feedback on that. From the site's perspective, their scheduling now can be perhaps a little bit more efficient in being able to deal with all the patients that are required to recruit for these clinical trials. It's again not completely unfair for them to expect that we provide for them some support in being able to distribute these devices to these patients in a timely fashion, but yet keep them as part of that day-to-day connection back to the patient. Ultimately, they're responsible for monitoring their patients, for recruiting them, and for ensuring the ongoing safety of their patients as they move through the studies. Our sponsors certainly have their expectations. The hope is that this is going to provide some cost savings, but also provide some new data streams where we can look at this data in real time and be able to make some better informed decisions on whether or not the study is showing some efficacy or safety and being able to move forward. In many of these cases, a core lab might be needed to be able to review this data on an ongoing basis, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. And then from the regulators' perspective, they've had to adapt to this new technology. Their main questions, their focus is in determining whether or not the drug or the device that we're being investigated is showing safety and efficacy. Is the data from the sensors that we've selected reliable and appropriate? Does it still continue to demonstrate that safety and efficacy confidence that we've been accustomed to over the years? And does the data continue to correlate with other study parameters and not just stand on its own, heading in its own separate direction? Next slide, please. So we can see that there's a number of different types of devices that we have. Some of them might require, some studies may only require one of these. Some of these may be able to benefit from the use of many of these devices. Some devices can be used by the patient alone while they're at home, going on their day-to-day lives. The integration of some of these devices may also be used in the clinic to allow us to get concurrent data as a patient has experienced different events. A 6-minute walk, for example, that we may be looking at in one of our clinical trials. So we have to kind of keep in mind, what is the data that we're looking for? Is it what we really need? Just because we can monitor patients 24/7, 365 doesn't always mean that we should. How do we visualize this data? Is just a standard listing something that is useful and beneficial, or do we need to improve on the visualization tools and the summary tools that are going to be utilized for this? Do we take means over the hour? Do we take averages over other specific intervals to look at what's happening for these patients? Because we're collecting data in a much more robust manner, the expectation is that we react to that data much more quickly. So that means that, are we going to look at this and interact with that patient much more frequently if we see that the data, for example, is not being collected for a period of time, be it a couple of hours or a day, and not wait for the patient to call us, but perhaps we need to, through the sites, contact the patient directly. And we have to match that burden to the patient without making them feel that we're constantly monitoring them, that they're under a microscope, with the potential loss of data that could result if we don't interact very quickly. So it's a very difficult balance that we have to keep in mind. And the other thing is the core lab oversight in terms of some of that safety data. For things like ECG, we're pretty much accustomed to the fact that an ECG, a 12-lead ECG, comes in, it's reviewed by a board-certified cardiologist, and that person makes some determination of whether or not an arrhythmia is being seen, whether or not some intervals are actually being prolonged, and whether or not the different arrhythmias are impacting on some of those measures. And adding to that, something more than just what a number might be able to demonstrate for that patient. Next slide, please. So as we decide on moving forward with picking these different biosensors, we have to make sure that the sensors are available in the different regions that we're going to be conducting these clinical trials, that the data from them is validated, that it has received approval, if necessary, from the different regulatory agencies in the different countries. We have to provide device logistics on how we're going to get these devices to the site. We need to balance the patient privacy, GDPRS, along with ensuring that the data that's being collected really represents data from that patient and not someone else who's at that patient's home. We need to ensure that the data is being captured and stored in a protected manner, meeting all of those different regulatory requirements and allowing us to visualize it in a way that allows us to act quickly for that. And we also need to integrate that with other study records, as I mentioned before. If we're collecting blood pressure, we need to maybe look at whether the patient is receiving their drug dose at an appropriate time frame, and how does this change in blood pressure reflect their dosing time. And then review and analysis tools, working with our statisticians. We need to determine what is the best way to visualize these tools, to provide them in a study report so that the regulatory agencies can still feel that they have oversight of the safety and efficacy of these compounds. And we have to be able to provide that on an ongoing basis for that patient management, for the site to interact with them, as well as for us to be able to view that. So with that, we need to also have, and what we have done at Medpace is provided a vendor neutral platform where we can integrate devices from different manufacturers and integrate them into a single study for use and integration with all of that study record. As a way to demonstrate how successful we've been with that, we've partnered with a number of folks, including Vivalink. And so I'd like to turn things over now to my partner, Marielle Fabreau at Vivalink, to show some case studies and how we've successfully implemented these strategies. Marielle?
Thank you so much, Dr. Zavattino. It's a pleasure to be here today with you and Dr. Lane and our audience to really discuss the domain of decentralized clinical trials or hybrid trials, and to really illustrate how we, as a partnership between Vivalink and Medpace, are powering the virtualization of clinical research. Next slide, please. And what we're doing here really to provide the foundation is to have a turnkey end-to-end data solution. And this is describing here a full stack technology approach, which spans from body-worn sensors to end-use applications in analytics. The data pipeline here is built to really ensure the data integrity and utility for clinical research purposes, and also from the vantage point of regulatory aspects as well. And so with this partnership, we are leveraging expertise in biomedical signals and their relevance to therapeutic areas, as well as information technology infrastructure. And so in a classic approach here, we are looking at body-worn sensors, which are continuously or episodically transmitting data via wireless connections through things like mobile applications, which are very user-friendly, and to then pass forward that data to data repositories, such as the cloud, to perform further analytics upon that data, and to provide the appropriate visualization of that data via end-use applications, or to be compatible with the typical data analysis tools that would be used in clinical research. The expertise here is really founded on the infrastructure for the Internet of Medical Things or healthcare things. And this involves device integration, really curating the devices which will provide the information of interest and that are most relevant to the data endpoints. Also, along the entire data path, we are entirely monitoring that data and managing that data to ensure that not only is there full integrity of the data and of the highest quality, but that it's really where it's supposed to be, when it's supposed to be, in the fashion and form that it's supposed to be. And these are nuances related to not only the study design, but also the understanding of the biomedical signals themselves and how that data gets structured and organized and optimized for the data management team, and furthermore for the statistical analysis team. And all of this within this information technology infrastructure is fully automated with several checkpoints along the way in the back end of the architecture to ensure that it is seamless for the study team, but it is also user-friendly for the study participants. And of utmost importance, of course, as described by my colleagues here today. We know that in a highly regulated field, we must always ensure the security of the data, the privacy of the patients, and the compliance matters adherent to the various geographical regions and their regulatory bodies. And so in the next slide, I'd like to begin discussing a few case studies where we see implementations of these technologies and the appropriate operations to ensure full executability of decentralized clinical trials. In our first example, we are actually talking about just the foundation, a small leap really to the virtualization of clinical research. And so this is happening on site. So within the study site, there is the implementation of a 6-minute walk test. This is a typical assessment, of course, for cardiopulmonary disease. And so in the space of pulmonary hypertension and therapeutics, therefore, we are looking at the digital measures of ECG, heart rate, and respiratory rate. This is all captured during the 6-minute walk test routine. And the study objective here is to determine the effect of the therapeutic drug. This is actually a multi-centered study, randomized, double-blinded, interventionally, worldwide. And so the endpoint of the change in 6-minute walk test is achieved by the data capture of the device, which is body worn, the data collection, which will be guided by a workflow on site via a mobile application, and this will be deployed globally. These are key challenges in consideration of the nuances of what it means to be recording data on a moving individual in an ambulatory condition, and to also be able to ensure that the data collection workflow can be conducted seamlessly. In the next slide, the solution that we have deployed here is to enable this workflow for the study team by providing a customized study assessment mobile app. And so the study site can simply be conducting the workflow via a tablet or a mobile phone, for example. And meanwhile, the routine for the 6-minute walk test is proceeded with the individual wearing the body-worn patch while they walk according to the workflow. Now, under this ambulatory condition, it is necessary to understand that there is potentially noisy data. And so at the signal processing level, we indeed are filtering or marking that data accordingly. So it's well understood by the data management team. Additionally, given the fact that the participant is walking along a path, perhaps in and out of range of the wireless connection, it is imperative that we ensure that the continuous data capture is unimpeded. And so we do this with having onboard memory on the device so that it is always housing that data and it is passing off that data according to a first in, first out paradigm, regardless of the wireless connectivity. Furthermore, the data consolidation is totally controlled automatically across the multiple sites worldwide, and that is passed forward to the data repository on the cloud. That data is available to the data management team and analysis team via API data queries, so they can pull down the necessary data elements relevant to the endpoint evaluation. As this is a global study, the logistics are handled by provisioning pre-programmed mobile devices with that workflow guiding mobile application. And that is distributed worldwide with additional localization support, which means that aspects in regards to data storage as well as native language support on the application are handled via this solution. Now, in our next case study, we are moving forward to remote monitoring at home. And in this particular case, we are talking about remote continuous ECG monitoring for the study subjects. This is now venturing into the space of digital biomarkers, where in the domain of atrial fibrillation, we are looking at the potential digital biomarkers for early atrial transformation in AFib. This is in fact a single center study conducted by an academic institution, longitudinal, spanning 10 years, with 3,000 participants. The digital measures here include the capture of ECG as well as sleep and activity. The participants of the study are wearing the device for 1 week out of each month, spanning the 10 years. And ultimately, the endpoints to be evaluated here are the incidence, progression, and recurrence of AFib. Now, this is being conducted entirely at home with these individuals. And so the aspects of this study to consider are the extended wear time and the multiple wearing cycles that will be conducted throughout the course of the study. Additionally, these are ambulatory conditions. These participants are going about their activities of daily living, and that, of course, will ensue a variety of interesting things in the data. And lastly, because we know that this data will be further analyzed in a classic way for ECG analysis, it is necessary to ensure that the data itself will be compatible with those typical analytic tools. And so in the next slide, the solution that we have deployed here is an end-to-end data service. The data itself is, of course, captured by the body-worn sensor continuously in this fashion. And at the other end of the pipeline, there is a classic method of ECG analysis. And so the data format, as well as the data elements available to the team that is responsible for the analysis, is entirely handled by the system. Now, this is the deployment of an ECG patch, which is entirely reusable, rechargeable, also regulatory authorized for the purposes of ECG data recording. And it is entirely patient self-serviceable, which means it is at least user-friendly enough that the individuals can apply the patch, can then remove the patch, and can recharge it accordingly, and continue to maintain it throughout the course of the study. Now, as we discussed in the earlier case study, there is onboard cache, similarly for this device, again, to ensure that in all of the ambulatory conditions, whether that individual is at home, has left the home, has forgotten their mobile phone, it does not matter. That data is residing on the device itself and will automatically be passed off to the cloud when the wireless connection is regained. And then lastly, to facilitate the analytics upon the data, the ECG signal, which was captured from the device, has been fully validated with world-class ECG analysis tools, which are typically seen in the clinical research space and used for assessments such as for cardiac safety. And then lastly, in our final example, we venture into the space of oncology. And in this particular study, we're actually seeing the blending of the last two case studies, wherein we have a transitioning of the utilization of the technology from the hospital to the home. And in this particular study, also the objective is to determine biomarkers, but it is for the early detection of neutropenic fever and to facilitate intervention, therefore. This is an exploratory multi-study study with the digital measures of heart rate, respiratory rate, and temperature coming from the body-worn sensors. Ultimately, the endpoints here are the incidence of neutropenic fever. So the key challenges are somewhat of a blend of what we discussed earlier. This is an on-site application, then transitioning to remote monitoring. Of course, these individuals are ambulatory in their homes, but they might be spending considerable amounts of time in resting states as they are quite weakened. And so the data will fluctuate between these two situations. And lastly, as an exploratory study, indeed the data is being examined retrospectively. But the further stages of this pursuit are really to facilitate a real-time monitoring situation for individuals to facilitate the early intervention. So the solution here in the next slide describes that the technology is straightforward whether you're on site or you're at home. The clinical staff can apply the body-worn sensors prior to discharge and get the system running on the mobile app. That same system travels home with the individual, and there's no difference in the usage. It's already been automated to be capturing the data. As we saw previously, the ability for the patients to self-service the devices at home, to know that the user friendliness there and the patient centricity has been considered is quite important. And of course, this data is a multi-vital recording, given the interest in aggregating that data for the purposes of the biomarker. And it is continuously syncing all of this data. Now, we did speak about the fact that it is retrospective, and when it's a retrospective assessment, we will be optimizing the data packets to be efficiently streaming that data for the purposes of the study. However, when we extend and scale that to a more real-time paradigm, then we may structure those data packets differently. And these are some of the careful considerations of how that data is structured. And so in this particular situation, we do know all too well that in a current care model, we often see rehospitalization of the patients sometime after their intervention, and in this case, 4 days post. Now, in an early detection model, with the data lined up and synchronized and having contextualization across multi-vital parameters, we're able to see abnormalities much earlier on in the time frame. And so it potentiates the window for early intervention. And so this is a spectrum really of looking at the power of biosignals and the proper optimization of the data to support the study endpoints, but also to build upon that foundation for the future pursuits of that research. And so with that, I'd like to turn it back over to my colleague, Dr. Zabatino, to discuss what we've learned here today.
Thank you. That was a great summary of some of our case studies and how we've been able to implement that in clinical trials. So what have we kind of reviewed today? First of all, biosensors are driving decentralized trials, or is it the other way around? I don't think it really makes much difference. What we do know is that both of those technologies are here, and we're going to be seeing more and more of them as we start enrolling in more trials. Clearly, these remote biosensors and decentralized trials do provide multiple benefits across the board, from patients to sites to the regulatory agencies, so that we can be able to review better data and make better decisions on whether or not these new technologies, compounds, are actually benefiting our patients. We do realize that while it may seem very easy, slap on a watch and we're ready to go, it may or may not be quite that easy to do as we go and look at all these different countries and different sites around the world and different types of patients that we're going to be working with. So we have to keep in mind, how are we going to collect, how are we going to integrate, analyze, and ultimately harmonize the data being collected across the different case report forms and data fields in these clinical trials. The data acquisition that is going to happen has to start from beginning to end in order to ensure that we have the right procedures in place to end up with data that the regulatory agencies can utilize to make that final determination and give us our approvals. At the end, we have to make sure that the process that we implement is tailored to what we need to do and that it is fit for purpose from the position of the patient, the study team, and the regulatory agencies. So while it appears on the surface to be easy, it can be easy if you've got the right team in place and you've got the right devices and patients selected to make it possible. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And I think that we do have some time to answer some questions from our audience. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. Before we move into the Q&A session, I'd like to direct the audience's attention to the handouts module within GoToWebinar control panel, where they'll find some additional documentation related to today's presentation to download for some further reading. And I would like to also invite the audience to continue sending their questions or comments right now using the questions window for this Q&A portion of the webinar. Now, I've already received some questions, so we'll get ourselves started with those. The first question that we have for you begins with, it says, with so many different types of data, how does the Medpace Vivalink partnership deal with the different types of data streams that come from devices from different vendors in different formats? Further, how do you manage these remote data streams to provide sponsors with the clinical trial endpoints that they need?
Yes, and Mariel Fabro here from the Vivalink side, and I'm very happy to answer this question. There's multi-layers to it, really. You know, when we think about biomedical signals, there's a few nuances there that are coming from the wearable devices, and I think, you know, Dr. Zabatino said it really well. We paint a pretty picture here, but it's not just about slapping watches onto an arm. Each device has particular data which it is capturing from the body-worn situation. The turnkey data platform, which we presented today, is really meant to more efficiently integrate any number of devices. We prefer medical grade, but oftentimes consumer grade devices are chosen by study sponsors, and that's fine. And this is where aspects of the information technology infrastructure come into play. And so there are mechanisms for us to quickly integrate devices, but even more so, for us to, from our domain expertise in biomedical signals, to appreciate the aggregation of that data appropriate to the study design, and to further transmit, or rather transform that data for the appropriate features. So I'll simply say this is biosignals are waveforms, for example. But what you really want are certain data elements, and those data elements are directly relevant to the endpoint evaluation. And so this is part of the process, really, of filtering through what you get from a very raw signal to the very finite data element of interest. And that's all included in the integration process. And then lastly, to ensure that the data management team itself has the ability to access those specific data elements, so they don't have to worry about the large volume of the original raw data itself, although it's always there, of course, for regulatory purposes, but the conversion and the mapping to the specific data has already been accomplished.
Excellent, thank you very much. Our next question that we have here would like to know, is artificial intelligence being used for triggering issues and communicating excursions to the investigator and the clinic?
So maybe I could try to answer that one for you. The question does come up, and I tried to sort of allude to that when we were talking about the use of a core lab. The data itself might just be something that is very simple and easy to view, and we can do that, you know, maybe through some graphs, or it might require some kind of central review by a physician to make some clinical determination. As that physician reviews the data, certain algorithms can start to develop where we can start to use AI to identify those patterns and then be able to more quickly report them back to the site and maybe report them back to the patient. But I think that we need to kind of look at what is it that we want to look at, what are the flags that are going to appear, so that we can then go ahead and develop our systems to identify them, filter out any of the potential noise, because, you know, as we collect more and more data, we're going to get a lot of noise that comes along with that. So it's being able to filter that and make educated decisions on what is real and what requires immediate action. So I think we can certainly see that coming up in the future.
Wonderful, thank you very much. For our next question we have here, it asks, how does industry align with the regulators on the incorporation of digital endpoints in clinical trials?
Yeah, Ryan, Richard Lee, Medpace. Maybe I can take this one. Thank you for your question. It's an excellent question. I think the simple answer is for alignment, industry alignment with the regulators, because this is an evolving field. The best recommendation, the best approach is to have early discussions with the FDA, the EMA, with the regulators on defining what are acceptable biosensors to be used and identifying endpoints, whether they're digital endpoints, meaning endpoints that are completely defined by a digital biosensor, such as actigraphy, or whether they are traditional endpoints that could be monitored by a digital biosensor. And I think that because it's an evolving, maturing field, the regulators certainly have not set out any guidance per se on virtual trials, on DCTs, and they have not endorsed any particular virtual solutions or strategies. And I think the best way to align with the regulators is in your SPA meetings with the FDA or scientific advice meetings with the EMA, to have a very frank discussion about which sensors and which endpoints would be acceptable for this particular stage of drug development. So I think that would be probably the wisest approach in terms of interaction with the regulators.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much. All right, for our next question, it begins by saying that some remote biosensor data comes in the form of temporal waveforms, like ECG, that require some medical expertise to read and detect problems. Others just generate numbers like the number of steps a patient takes every day. The question is, what is the role of a core laboratory in managing these different types of remote sensor data in DCTs?
So that's a great question. I think I tried to touch on that a few moments ago. I think it depends on the data itself and how we're going to act on it. Certainly in ECG, while some of these devices will give you intervals, may give you a first alert on whether or not you've got something along the lines of an arrhythmia of AFib, perhaps. Some of that does require a physician to review and to make a clinical determination on that. So I think, again, showing the data, deciding what action and the timing of that action may determine whether or not a central review core lab is going to be needed. We can implement a number of different read paradigms depending on the type of data that's there. We can also integrate the review of multiple data sources to see that the pattern makes sense. Is the person supposed to be sleeping, and yet are we recording some data that may demonstrate that they're not sleeping? So looking at what the purpose of that data is, and then trying to ensure that we provide the right set of eyes to look at it in that timely fashion.
All right, wonderful. Thank you very much for that great answer. So next we have something that states that the COVID pandemic accelerated the move to DCTs, and COVID vaccine trials did use a lot of remote biosensor data for safety monitoring of ECGs. As the world returns to normal, will clinical trials return to the old way of collecting patient data with participants visiting clinical sites for lab and imaging assessments?
Yeah, Brian, Richard Lee again. I can tackle this one. Yeah, excellent question. Thank you for your question. I think we're still in a learning phase, and time will only tell how much of biosensors and which specific biosensors are going to withstand the test of time. I hope from my section of the webinar, I've impressed upon you that certainly hybrid trials or at least partially decentralized trials are going to continue, and biosensors, if anything, the technology is going to only improve. And so I think that there's going to be capabilities that we aren't even appreciating even now. So I think that it's hard to predict in the future which trials, which devices are necessarily going to going to stay, I think it's safe to say that if you look at the trials now, glucose monitoring, continuous glucose monitoring, vital signs monitoring, actigraphy, and wearable cardiac rhythm devices. Those are sort of all I think that the most common digital assessments that we see in clinical trials. And I think that visits, with regards to visits and virtual visits, I think that we will have to see how this develops, because many patients do enjoy the option of having a virtual visit. So I think it's quite possible that there will be a combination of schedule of assessments where certain visits, if they're not requiring any assessment that has to be done at the site, may become an option, may continue to be given as an option to as a virtual visit, a telemedicine visit. So I think I do think that there are going to be assessments, and virtual visits just in some capacity are going to continue as we move forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that answer and for all of the answers today. However, we have reached the end of the Q&A portion of the webinar. Now, if we couldn't attend to your questions, though, the team at Medpace and Vivalink will follow up with you. Or if you have further questions, you can direct them to the email addresses that are up on your screen. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen as you exit, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now I'm about to send you a link in the chat box, and with this link you'll be able to view the recording of this event on this page, and you can also share this link with your colleagues when they register for the recording here as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, please join me once more in thanking our speakers for their time here today, Dr. Richard Lee, Dr. Salvatore Zabatino, and Mariel Fabro. We hope that you all found the webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone, and thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.